Chapter 3. A Chase. "Let me go, or I'll scream!" Nancy cried out. Instantly, the man released her arm, but he swiftly stepped in front of her. "Wait a minute," he commanded. "You want to help your father, don't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Nancy said warily. She studied the husky, broad-shouldered man. He had heavy brows, deep-set eyes, and a cruel mouth. "You're Nancy Drew, aren't you?" Nancy hesitated, afraid he might be trying to find her father to harm him. "Are you sure you're talking to the right person?" she asked. "Okay," the man said bitterly. "Play it smart. It's been years since I saw Drew, and maybe I'm wrong, but I could be right, so you take a message." Nancy did not reply, and the stranger went on. "Tell Carson Drew to mind his own business, or he's in for a bad shock." "If you're through," Nancy said coldly, "I'll go now." The man stepped aside, and she hurried from the parking lot, her heart pounding. As she reached the sidewalk, Nancy came face to face with two friends. "Why, Nancy Drew!" exclaimed Jean Moss. "I haven't seen you in weeks." Her escort, Bill Wright, added, "Been solving any mysteries lately?" Nancy's heart sank. Had the man in the parking lot heard them? She managed to talk pleasantly with the couple for a few minutes, but she was worried. As Jean and Bill moved off, Nancy heard a soft laugh from the shadows. A moment later, a deep voice said mockingly, "Good night, Miss Drew." The speaker melted into the darkness. Biting her lip in vexation, Nancy ran to police headquarters. The officer on duty directed her to the detective bureau. Here, Mr. Drew was conferring with Lieutenant Mulligan, a red-faced, brawny man with thinning hair. He knew the Drews only by reputation. Once again, Nancy told her story. The detective jotted down the partial license number of the suspicious car. When Nancy handed him the bracelet, he said, "Has an inscription, but it's old. Mary and Joe could have been dead for years. No last names or dates either. Afraid it won't be much use to us." "If you don't mind," Nancy said, "I'd like to see if I can trace the owner." "Go ahead," the lieutenant said and gave it back. "We'll check out the car's license number, but probably the kidnappers are using phony plates." As Nancy and her father walked to the parking lot, she told him about the stranger who had accosted her there and the warning message. Mr. Drew frowned. "I don't know who he could be. Some crank, I suppose." Cars were closely parked on either side of Nancy's convertible, so she gave her full attention to pulling out of the tight space. Soon after she had driven into the street and turned toward home, headlights appeared in her mirror. The right one was dim. "Dad, the same car that followed us before is behind us," Nancy said tensely. "I'm afraid the driver's the man who wants to harm you. Let's try to shake him." Keeping within the speed limit, Nancy drove into the residential section of the city, taking every cutoff and winding street she knew. Meanwhile, Mr. Drew watched the car behind, which continued to follow. "It seems useless to try getting away," he said finally. "I'd like to get a good look at the driver." "All right," Nancy replied. She increased her speed, widening the distance between the two cars, until she approached an intersection where there was a bright overhead light. She swung around, her tires squealing on the asphalt, and stopped short, facing her pursuer. When he came abreast of them, Carson Drew gasped. "Trail him," the lawyer ordered as the driver zoomed off. Nancy turned again and pursued the sedan. Just as she was about to overtake it, the traffic light ahead turned red. The driver rode straight through, rounded a corner, and disappeared. Nancy sighed. "We'll never find him now." "Never mind," said Mr. Drew. "It was a good try. Let's go home." "Who was that man, Dad?" Nancy asked. "Adam Thorne, an escaped convict. Thank goodness he didn't hurt you." Nancy shuddered. What was he jailed for? Thorne was given 10 years for embezzling the assets of an estate. While in jail, he became very bitter and at times violent. "But what's his interest in you?" Nancy queried. Mr. Drew explained that Thorne had been a River Heights attorney. He was disbarred prior to his trial, and I was in charge of gathering the evidence against him. "I see," said Nancy. "Dad, I have a hunch Adam Thorne is involved in the Bluebell mystery. He must have been spying outside Dr. Spire's house and recognized you. Probably he's not only looking for revenge, but wants to keep us from working on the case. I'm afraid you're right. For Pete's sake, be careful, Nancy." "You too, Dad." A few minutes later, the Drews reached home. While Nancy checked on Hannah, who was asleep, Mr. Drew called Lieutenant Mulligan and reported his daughter's encounter with Adam Thorne and the resultant unsuccessful chase. "If Thorne's tied in with Dr. Spire's kidnapping," said Mulligan, "he'll stop at nothing. I'll broadcast a bulletin immediately." The next morning, Nancy was up early and went to talk to Hannah Gruen. "I have good news for you," the housekeeper said. "My niece Effie has offered to come here and work while I'm laid up." "Good. Effie's fun." "And scatterbrained sometimes," Hannah remarked. After breakfast, Nancy drove off to get Effie Schneider. When she rang the bell of the small frame cottage, the door was opened by Effie's mother. "Hello, Mrs. Schneider," said Nancy. "How are you?" "Fine, thanks. Please come in. Effie isn't dressed yet. She's been reading a movie magazine instead of putting on her clothes." "Effie!" she called. "Here I am, Mom," a high-pitched voice replied. "Hi, Nancy," said the girl as she walked into the living room, munching a banana. "Hello, Effie," Nancy greeted the thin 17-year-old girl. Effie had light blonde hair, which she wore close-cropped with feathery bangs over her forehead. She was dressed in a Chinese-style pink kimono with high-heeled satin mules. "This outfit is like the one Ling Su wore in the movie The Chinese Wall Mystery," Effie remarked, making an oriental bow. Nancy grinned, but Mrs. Schneider said tartly, "Hurry up and put on street clothes, Effie." As her daughter went off, Mrs. Schneider turned to Nancy. "Once Effie stops mooning about movie stars and singers, she's really a good worker and a dandy cook." Nancy had her doubts about this, but later was agreeably surprised when Effie prepared a delicious luncheon of chicken salad, hot rolls, and iced tea. She would not let Nancy help her. "Aunt Hannah told me you're working on a mystery," Effie said. "That's exciting. You keep your mind on the case. I'll do the work around the house. I once read a mystery about a circus girl who was shot out of a cannon and disappeared. It took 3 detectives a whole month to find her. Bet you can't guess where." Nancy grinned. "Inside the cannon?" "Oh, gee! How'd you know?" Effie said. "You must have read the story." "No, I didn't." Bewildered, Effie shook her head and walked off. After eating lunch, Nancy decided to start tracing the owner of the bracelet. Half an hour later, she walked into Butler and Stone's jewelry store and asked for Mr. Stone, who was a personal friend. "Well, Nancy, what can I do for you?" the jeweler asked cordially. "Are you interested in a diamond-studded detective badge today?" he teased. Nancy laughed. "Do you sell them?" she countered. "Oh, sure. To the police," the jeweler replied with a grin. Nancy took the bracelet from her purse. "Mr. Stone, could you trace this coat of arms?" The jeweler held the bracelet toward the window to get a better look at the heraldic design on the shield. As he did, Nancy noticed a large woman in a pink butterfly print dress looking through the plate glass window. "Just a moment," Nancy said quickly to Mr. Stone. "Is there some other place?" The jeweler understood at once. "Another mystery?" he asked. When Nancy nodded, he motioned to a private office at the back of the store. Once again, Mr. Stone examined the bracelet. "This was made in Victorian times," he announced. "I doubt if it was designed around here. An attractive coat of arms. 3 mullets dexter and a Maltese cross sinister. Crest, a falcon's head embattled, with the motto Esse quam videre. Every authentic coat of arms is a matter of record," Mr. Stone explained. "It will take time, but we will be able to trace the family, if not the individual owner. May I keep the bracelet temporarily?" Nancy hesitated. "It doesn't belong to me," she said. "Could you make a copy of the crest?" "Certainly. Please take a seat." Mr. Stone excused himself and went out. In 15 minutes he returned, gave the bracelet to Nancy, and said he would send the tracing to Mr. Abelard de Gotha, an expert on coats of arms. "Thank you. I'll stop by in a couple of days to see if you've heard about it," Nancy said. As the young detective left the store, her thoughts turned to the sick woman who had given the bracelet to Dr. Spire. I wonder who she is, poor thing. At the corner, Nancy waited with a group of people for the light to change. As the walk signal came on, someone pushed roughly past her and darted out into the street. Nancy recognized the pink butterfly print dress, and at the same moment realized that her arm felt strangely light. "My handbag!" Nancy gasped. "It's gone!" The woman was hurrying ahead of the crowd. Nancy was sure she had stolen the bag and sprinted after her. "Stop!" Nancy shouted, but the woman broke into a run. Nancy put on a spurt of speed and caught up to her on the far sidewalk. "Give me back my—" The big woman whirled and gave Nancy a powerful push that sent her reeling. She fell backward off the curb. End of chapter 3.